Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we're dealing with Luke chapter 19, verses 11 through 27, so you might want to be turning there. Luke 19, verses 11 through 27. This is kind of cutting in the middle of a couple of different stories. You have Jesus who is traveling back to Jerusalem, at least theologically speaking. Luke is very interesting in that a lot of the organization from, I think it's the end of Luke chapter 9 on through the rest of the book, through especially here in chapter 19, is Jesus traveling back to Jerusalem. At the end of chapter 9, it says he set his face towards Jerusalem, meaning basically he's intentionally headed towards Jerusalem. But if you actually track the geography of his movements, he's not going straight down to Jerusalem, or rather straight up, as they used to say, up to Jerusalem. He's not going straight there. He's going around the countryside, and he's visiting all these different locations and all these different people. And, why would he be doing that? Well, it's because he's determined to go to Jerusalem. Jesus knows when he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to be executed. He's going to die over Passover. But he also knows that it's going to wait until Passover. And so it's him steeling himself to get ready for the problems that are going to arise for him. But he is vaguely headed that direction. Here in Luke 19, we're finally at the final stretch of that journey, and he can't delay anymore. Passover is coming up next week. He starts in Luke 19 with Zacchaeus. Jesus enters Jericho, which is right near Jerusalem, and he converts Zacchaeus there. He works with him. Then he tells this parable. That's the parable we're focusing on. And immediately after this is when Jesus gives the instructions for how he's going to enter Jerusalem for the Passover and borrow a donkey and all that and ride into the city in the often called the triumphal entry. So we're right at the end here, at the end of his journey. And he decides to go and tell a story to the people who are there with him. Jesus is talking to Zacchaeus and some others, whoever else is around him, his disciples and presumably some crowds that are hearing him out. And Jesus decides to tell this parable. This is a familiar parable. Here it's called the 10 Minas, or minas, or however you say that. I don't know. It's called that. It's 10 pieces of money, essentially. We know a very similar parable from Matthew chapter 25. It's the second section of Matthew 25, that is the parable of the 10 talents, talent also being a large section of money, or it's the parable of the talents because at some point there are at least 10 talents that are grouped together. This is a very familiar kind of story, is the point I'm trying to make, because we know this, we've read this in Matthew before, we're going to be familiar with it from that perspective, but also it's not that familiar of a story, because when Luke tells it, he's telling it a bit differently. Matthew's story of the talents is taking place once Jesus enters Jerusalem. Then he tells the story to communicate to people something about how you use your abilities for God and God's return and how God will judge. Matthew 25 begins with the parable of the 10 virgins. The 5 of them were prepared for the bridegroom to come, and 5 of them weren't. So those ones who were prepared were accepted in, and the ones who weren't prepared were rejected. Matthew 25 ends with a parable, or not really a parable, but a picture of Judgment Day, where God is going to divide people to his right and his left, and he's going to pick some people to go into heaven, and he's going to pick the others to not go into heaven. And everybody's going to be confused on that day. Why did they end up at the place they're at? To which God gives them an answer, and then sends them to the place where they're supposed to be going. In Matthew 25, the parable of the talents is about how you use your abilities in anticipation of the judgment coming. And in Luke, it's not really about that. It's more about timing, and it's more about the nature of the kingdom of God, and one might even say it's about the nature of God himself. One would say this is harsher. This parable is a bit harsher than the talents parable. It's a bit broader of a scope than the talents parable. One of the reasons this is called the 10 Minas parable is there are 10 individuals who get 1 mina each to go out and do something, whereas in the talents parable, one man gets 5 talents, one gets 2, and another gets 1, according to his ability. And so you have a different point that's being made there. Again, don't conflate these two. These may seem similar, They're both about a nobleman who goes away. They're both about slaves who are left to work in his stead. They're both about the nobleman giving the slaves resources and expecting the slaves to do some work, and then rewarding or being upset with the slaves who do not, or who do work properly and don't work properly, respectively. They have the same kind of external trappings in those ways, but these are different stories. So we're going to look at the 10 minas today. One of the points that's made very clearly in both of these stories is that it really doesn't matter how you end up feeling about God. Something that's going to come through is that doesn't affect God at all. And whether you love him or you hate him, you'd be better off submitting and obeying him. That's something you're going to see as we go through the story. Now, keep it in mind. Luke 19, I'll read verses 11 through 27, and keep an eye out for the language in this, because it sounds a little bit different than some other parables do. Luke 19, I'll start reading in verse 11. Now while they were listening to these things, Jesus went on to tell a parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and they thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear immediately. So he said, "A nobleman went to a distant country to receive a kingdom for himself, and then to return. And he called 10 of his own slaves and gave them 10 minas, and said to them, 'Do business with this money until I come back.' But his citizens hated him, and sent a delegation after him, saying, 'We do not want this man to reign over us.' When he returned after receiving the kingdom, he ordered that these slaves to whom he had given the money be summoned to him, so that he would learn how much they had made by the business they had done. The first slave appeared, saying, 'Master, your mina has made 10 minas more.' And he said to him, 'Well done, good slave. Since you have been faithful in a very little thing, you are to have authority over 10 cities.' The second one came, saying, 'Your mina, master, has made 5 minas.' And he said to him also, 'And you are to be over 5 cities.' And then another came, saying, 'Master, here is your mina, which I kept tucked away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you, because you are a demanding man. You take up what you did not lay down, and reap what you did not sow.' He said to him, 'From your own lips I will judge you, you worthless slave. Did you know that I am a demanding man, taking up what I did not lay down, and reaping what I did not sow? And so, why did you not put my money in the bank? And when I came back, I would have collected it with interest.' Then he said to the other slaves who were present, 'Take the mina away from him, and give it to the one who has 10 minas. They said to him, 'Master, he already has 10 minas? I tell you that to everyone who has, more shall be given. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them in my presence.'" Well, that got violent. It's kind of a weird story, right? Because as you're reading through this, it doesn't necessarily sound like a normal parable. Last week we talked about the rich man and Lazarus, which is, I believe it's a parable, or at least an unofficial parable. I don't think it's a true story that actually happened. I don't think Jesus is relaying historical fact. I think it's something that he's saying to make a point, more than it is a true and technically accurate accounting of what's going to happen in the afterlife. But there are differences of opinion on that, because it doesn't say he told them this parable. Here it is very clear it is a parable in verse 11. But even still, when you read through it, it doesn't feel like a normal parable. There are just kind of things that happen. So for instance, the one that really stands out to me is this nobleman goes away, he gives money to his slaves, he heads out of town, and in verse 14, his citizens hated him, and they send this delegation after him, saying, "We don't like him," and then you never hear from them again. The next verse is he comes back, and he's the king. Well, okay, what was the delegation for? What about these citizens? How are they relevant? And then they pop back up at the very end of the story. They haven't even been involved in any of this. And then in verse 27, the nobleman who has returned and is now king, just says, "All right, we're going to kill those guys." Well, hold on. Why is that in there? And it seems kind of odd, at least from this outside perspective. The story has really weird details. What is it? Why is it not in the parable of the talents, for instance? When the nobleman goes, or when the master goes, he just goes away for a while and then he comes back. Here, it's he goes to receive a kingdom and then he comes back, but then he only deals with his slaves, and he deals with his slaves. He could have done that as a nobleman. Why does he have to receive a kingdom to deal with his slaves? Well, maybe the receiving the kingdom is to deal with the people, but then he doesn't even deal with the people. Not normally. He just kind of does it by proxy at the very end of the story. After he's done dealing with his slaves, he doesn't even have a conversation with the citizens. He doesn't even meet them in person and try to understand where they're coming from or try to make peace or anything. He just kind of shows up and says, now that I'm done with the slaves, let's kill all those other guys. And it seems very odd, but as much as that story has weird details, a couple minutes here at the beginning could be well served in talking about the inspiration behind the story. What does it mean he's receiving a kingdom? Why is there this delegation following him? These feel weird to just kind of be inserted into the parable, and they don't really have a specific payoff. It doesn't seem like, or at least they're kind of tangentially connected at first, and it seems kind of odd that Jesus would just throw that in there, but from what I've read, there may well be a background to this story. So this is speculative because I don't know all of the history, but this is what I've read. Herod the Great, who I believe was the one in Matthew chapter 2 who tried to murder Jesus when he was a baby. Herod the Great dies between that. Jesus is taken off to Egypt. Mary and Joseph and Jesus relocate to Egypt and live there until, at the end of Matthew 2, Herod dies and his son replaces him, at which point Herod the Great's not going to kill them anymore because Herod the Great just died, and so they return to the land. I'm pretty sure that's the Herod the Great they're talking about. And after he dies, his son was named Archelaus. He was supposed to take over, but the way the Romans did things is the entire world is under Roman rule. You can rule as a little king under Rome, as in you can be like a state governor, basically, but you are adherent to Rome, ultimately. Rome is the authority source. You can't just take the kingdom for yourself. If you have a claim to the kingdom, then you have to take that and present that before Rome and make sure that you get ratified by Rome. So Herod the Great dies, and his son Archelaus apparently has to go and get ratified in Rome to show that he is the actual king. He has, his father was the king, but does it mean that he's going to be the next king? Well, Rome is the one who gets to decide that. And so this nobleman, Archelaus, has to go and receive the kingdom from this other nation of Rome. He has to head out and go get that, and the Jews didn't like him very much. The Jews never liked the Herods. It's partly an ancestral thing because Herods are from Edom. They're Edomians. Edom is all the way back in history. Jacob and Esau. Jacob gets his name changed to Israel, and Esau is often called Edom because it means red or something like that. There's a split back there. There's a familial split. They don't like each other very much. When you advance this by 1,500 years, more like 1,700 years, and you get to the New Testament time period, you have a split still between Israel and Edom. They still don't like each other, but Herod is an Edomite, and he is set in charge of Israel. He could pay enough money. He paid money to Rome. Rome said, you're good enough as a governor, and they stuck him in place. So the Herods who rule, one of the reasons that the Jews don't get along with them is because Herod is from this different nationality who ancestrally they hate each other. And it's no different with Archelaus, Herod Archelaus. The Jews end up sending a delegation to Rome and said, hey, we don't like this guy. Basically, he's so unpopular, could you not elect him? Is the point that's being made. When Archelaus arrived in Rome, his purpose was to make a case to the Roman governor or to the Roman emperor that he was a valid and valuable asset to them in that region, that he should be the king. And the Jews sent a delegation that said, hey, we really hate this guy. Could you not put him as the king? And ultimately Archelaus won. He came back and he was the ruler. And then allegedly when he came back, what do you think he did to the subjects that didn't like him very much? Well, There's a reason verse 27's in there as well. Jesus, when he tells the story, he probably isn't making making this up, right? This is a parable is oftentimes it's told in this like physical way so that you have something that you can relate it to. Well, sometimes he just rips off things that are true. Like the sower went out to sow. Yeah, no kidding. That's what they do, right? That's everybody's familiar with it. Somebody's baking a loaf of bread. Yeah, that's how it works. Somebody plants a tree and the tree grows. Yes, we can see that. Most or all of the people listening to Jesus would have planted trees before. Like, it's not that difficult for them to understand. This story about the nobleman, if it is in fact a close one-to-one parallel with Herod Archelaus and that ascension process, it would be very familiar to the Jews. They would know what he's talking about. So it seems like Jesus isn't making this up at all. He's actually patterning it off of a story. Those details that seem so odd at first glance actually kind of fit, and they make sense. They would know what he's talking about. But there's also a dual purpose here, because as much as Herod does this, and as much as Herod, by the way, Herod is a title. Herod just means like the king. So there's Herod the Great, and Herod the Second, and Herod Agrippa, and Herod Archelaus, and Herod over and over and over, because it just means the king. It just means like the guy in charge, the chieftain. So as much as I say Herod versus other things, I'm meaning Herod the Great versus the other people who were also named Herod. Yay, confusion. I love Herod's family tree. As much as Jesus is throwing in details that seem kind of odd, he is patterning it off of history. And it's not just that the Jews did this to Herods, it's that the Jews have done this to God, is really the point that's being made. The deeper spiritual meaning behind this is, didn't the Jews treat God the same way? Jesus is, in many ways, when we get to the application of the story, we can talk about it a little bit. Who's the nobleman in the story? Who's the one who went away to receive a kingdom and then bring it back? Who's the one who has come down to give his servants all this blessing, all this resource, all this capability, and then is expecting them to give an accounting to him at the end of the day? Who's the one who gets to stand in judgment and execute those who are enemies of his? It's not humans. Right? Bad human beings can do that, sure, but that's not the human role. That's ultimately the role of God or Jesus. But the Jews do the same thing. In fact, 1 week later, they're going to do exactly the same thing to Jesus. 1 week later, Jesus is going to lose the popularity vote and ultimately get executed because of it, because the Jews are attempting to say, we do not want this man to reign over us. When Pilate says, it's a horribly poetic kind of thing. When Pilate says, look at this man, isn't he the king of the Jews? And the Jews say, we have no king but Caesar. It's the same thing here as verse 14. So they send a delegation after this guy. We don't want him to reign over us. We'd prefer Rome to rule over us directly. We don't want this guy in between. As right as they may have been that Herod Archelaus was a horrible person, they're using the same attitude to refer to God, and that is where the real problem lies. When Herod Archelaus came back at the end in verse 27 and he slaughtered a bunch of people, he was killing people because they didn't agree with him and he didn't like them. When God comes back at the end and condemns people to hell, he's condemning them because they didn't want in his kingdom. And so he's allowing them to not be in his kingdom. That's what hell is. So that's really where the story is coming from. I think that's what I've read, and it makes sense to me that Jesus would be paralleling that, and it also helps to explain some of the weird eccentricities of this story. It is quite understandable that God would deal harshly with his people when his people are busy treating him like he's this evil king that they hate. So that's the inspiration behind the story. Now we have to talk about the story itself. What's happening in this story? Well, you start in verse 11. Jesus begins to tell a parable to the crowd, because many in the crowd believe that the kingdom of God is about to appear right then. But there's a problem with that. they're very excited. They thought the kingdom of God was going to appear immediately. They're hyped up over this thing, like, hey, God's about to come back. God's about to come back. This is a great time. And Jesus tells them the story about what happens when the kingdom appears, which is to say, how many people die when the kingdom appears? It's not to say the kingdom's appearance is bad. It's not to say that you shouldn't be excited for the kingdom to appear, but it is to say, I think it is to say, you'd better be careful, people. You're so excited for the kingdom to appear, you're not even remembering how you're supposed to be living. What do you see about them? Think about the next story, the very next story, verses 28 through 44, is Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, and everybody shouting out for him. Blessed is the one who comes. Hosanna in the highest. He's the one who comes in the name of the Lord. This is this great thing. Yeah, that's on Sunday. By Thursday night, the Jews are forming into a mob to get this guy killed. Are they really ready for the kingdom to come? What happens when the kingdom comes? What happens when the king receives his throne and then returns to a people who at some points are variously excited about his presence and then at other points want him dead? What happens when Jesus comes back and calls them to account for the things that they've done? How excited do you think they're going to be when they meet the end of verse 27 where they're slaughtered in his presence? They are so excited for the kingdom to come, but in their idea, in their perception, the kingdom coming means getting rid of Rome entirely. What Jesus is saying, even by using the story of Archelaus Herod, is not, I'm going to disrupt the rule of Rome. He's actually saying, like, we're not disrupting the rule of Rome. Archelaus was submitting to the rule of Rome. He was continuing the rule of Rome. It's not that God is going to back up the Roman Empire, but it is that Jesus is not going to upset the status quo. Over and over again, when Jesus is questioned in the next couple of chapters, especially going into in chapter 20, in the next chapter, verses 20 through 25, or 26, they're questioning him. Do we actually need to pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, yeah, he owns the money, doesn't he? Like, yeah, you have to. It's not to say that Jesus is, pro-Caesar and approves of everything Caesar does and follows after Caesar and is obedient to everything Caesar commands him to. No, he was the king of the Jews. That's kind of anti-Caesar. Caesar does not approve of anyone else being the king, but the reality is Jesus is the king of everything. Jesus is perfectly against Caesar sometimes when Caesar fights God. But that's not his purpose. His purpose is not to come down and reinstate a new form of human government for an area. Jesus' purpose is not to establish a physical earthly country. No, that's ridiculous. That's not what he's interested in. That's not his point. He is there to help people find the Lord. You can find the Lord whatever your physical kingdom is that you live in on the earth. They are so excited for Jesus to come and wreck the Romans that they've forgotten to honor Jesus as God and be obedient to him. And later on in the week, when he says enough things to indicate to them that he's not actually going to come and kill the Romans, then they're going to get angry with him. Then they're going to execute him within a week. Remember, the next story takes place on Sunday. Jesus is put on trial on Thursday night and dies on Friday. Within a week, these people who are so excited about the kingdom are going to murder him. What do you think is going to happen when he comes back? It's not going to be good for them. They are excited for something. They're so excited that they don't even realize it's going to slaughter them. So here's a warning, people. Be careful what you wish for. A nobleman is about to inherit a kingdom. While he's gone, his slaves get to work. Everyone is supplied the same. He orders 10 slaves. He gives them each 1 mina. All of them are given the same. And the point of the parable of the talents is that different people have different levels of ability, and so God gives different levels of blessing. Some have 5, some have 2, some have 1. Everybody has something, but some people have more and some people have less, and you are responsible for how much you use of that talent that you give, the percentage that you're using. Here, it's not that. That's not really the point. Everyone is supplied the same. Everyone is supplied. They're to do business as they can. That's the goal. And then when you make a return on the investment, that's good. That's worthwhile, and God approves of it. Now, the question here is not, are you the 1 talent guy or the 2 talent guy or the 5 talent guy? The question here is, are you going to be a faithful slave in the little thing that God gave you? Are you going to invest it and make a return for him? Or are you going to let the citizens of your country, of the country around you, infect you with this idea? Verse 14, we don't want this man to reign over us. What will happen if one of the slaves gets that idea in his head? You end up seeing it, don't you? The citizens of the country don't like him. Will that impact the slave's obedience? It better not, because it's not going to end well, because he is going to return. When he had returned, he's now the king. And now he's the chief authority in the land. The citizens' attempt to overthrow the king doesn't work. No matter how much they put into it, their attempt to get rid of the king who's in charge of them doesn't work. And with his new authority, that king calls his slaves to give an accounting to him, to see what they're doing. 3 of the slaves become the focus. He gave out 10 minas to 10 different individuals, but the story hones in on 3 because it's enough to make the point. 3 slaves become the focus. One of them does great with his work, one of them does fine with his work, and one of them also exists with his, well, work is a strong word, I'll put air quotes on that. His work is not very effective. The first slave makes a return for God. God has given him 1, and he says, look, master, verse 16. Sorry, I'm blurring the lines between the story and the application. The first slave returns to his master, the nobleman now turned king. And he says to the nobleman, look, your 1 mina that you gave me has made 10. Excellent use of authority, the authority and the resource that he was given. He worked, and it was effective. He receives authority over 10 cities. He was faithful in a little bit, and so he gets to be faithful now in a lot. He has served the king well, and he is rewarded for doing so. The second slave comes before the master, and he made a return of 5 to 1. He worked, and he was effective, and so he receives authority over 5 cities. Less impressive than the man who received authority over 10, but at the same time, he showed that he was not quite as capable. He still did well. He still did a pretty good job. So, there is reward for it. Less reward, sure, but an adequate reward for the work that he put in and the capability that he was given. He did his job, and now he gets to serve the king to a greater degree. Fantastic. First slave, second slave, absolute bangers of individuals. That's an old phrase at this point. Oh well, it's 2026. What can I say? I'm 10 years behind the cultural meme curve, I guess. First and second slave, fantastic. Third slave gets called in. The third slave also received one mina, and he makes a return of less than nothing. As is pointed out by the master a little bit later on, why did you not put this in the bank, and then I would have collected it with interest? This is not to say that it would have been acceptable to put the mina in a bank and then, earn 3% over the month or year or however long the master was gone. This is not to say that that's acceptable and then that's the good thing. No, it's not to say that, if you were to break with this for a second and make application, some people try and make the application the first slave invested his talent and he did really well. So do that. That's acceptable. The second slave invested his talent, and he did pretty well, and so that's acceptable. The third slave, the master says you should have put it in the bank. So it would be perfectly acceptable before God if you bury your talent as long as you kind of bank it somewhere, and then that's also perfectly acceptable. I wouldn't say that. I don't know that that is the acceptable course. What the master is saying is, bro, that's the bare minimum, is put it in the bank. What are you talking about? You kept it in a handkerchief. Another difference between this and the parable of the talents. In the parable of the talents, it was buried in the ground, but here it's in a handkerchief. Just keep in mind, those are 2 different tellings. This is not 2 different versions of the same story. This is Jesus telling it at 2 different points in time to 2 different groups of people with 2 different points because they are just functionally 2 different stories. This man kept it in a handkerchief. He decided not to serve the king, and he succeeded in not serving the king. It seems like something of the citizens' attitude kind of rubbed off on him. We don't want this man to reign over us. Well, look at what this third servant says. Verse 21, I was afraid of you. You're a demanding man. You take up what you don't lay down and reap what you don't sow. You know what that means is, well, I don't really want you in charge, which is exactly what the citizens have been saying. He was listening to the people around him a little too much. He got infected with their idea. Their idea, oh, this king he's going to be a really bad king. In physical circumstances, Herod Archelaus, yeah, definitely a physically bad king. In spiritual circumstances, when you do the same thing to God, you don't really know what's coming to you now, do you? The slave thought rebellion would work. This guy shouldn't be king. We sent a delegation after him. Therefore, he can't be king. Therefore, I think it's fine to just keep the money. Yeah, I'm not going to use it. On the rare chance that the king does come back, I don't want to like spend the money and then come up with nothing, but I'm not going to make any money for him either. I'm not going to do anything for him. Well, you can see how that works out for him. And it's unfortunate because he couldn't stop the king. Now he's going to learn better when the king comes in. The nobleman turned king and condemns him to his fate. He makes some pitiful excuse about how bad that king is, which ultimately goes nowhere, and the king even says, I will judge you by your own words. Verse 22, from your own lips I'll judge you. Right? This is what you said. Well, isn't that a stupid thing for you to have said? This guy shouldn't be king, according to the slave, but the slave doesn't really get a say in who's king now, does he? He makes some excuse. He tries to get away with it. Well, he gets punished along with everybody else who tries to fight. What can the slave actually do against the king? What can the citizens actually do against the king? See, the problem is the citizens think they can do something, and the slave thinks that he can get away with something. But he hasn't reckoned what a king actually is, which is this unstoppable force that can make his will happen, and he will force it to. You can't do anything about the king. And so you get to the end of the story, and here's what you find. You find that the king is unbothered because he's the king, and he's in control. There's nothing you can do about that. You find that the faithful servants are rewarded. They get to be little kings in their own right, ruling 10 cities or 5 cities individually based on how faithful they were. And you get to find that the ones who hated the king don't have to be around him anymore. They don't get to be part of his kingdom. Yeah, you don't want in the kingdom? Fine, you're not in the kingdom. Unfortunately, that means they're going to be slaughtered. But they didn't want the kingdom. They didn't want him to be king over them. And so the king is granting their wish. Everyone gets what he wants, or at least what he says he wants. And that's probably an important note to clarify. Ultimately, when the citizens are being brought in before the king and being slaughtered in his presence, do you think they have regrets over what they've done? Probably. But they made a decision. They didn't think through all the consequences. And now they have to suffer for it because they were stupid, stupid people. Don't be them. Don't be like them. It's not going to go well for you. The king is in charge. You are not going to win by trying to fight him. So now we get to applying the story. And applying the story is relatively simple. Here are a collection of points that will hopefully serve to clarify some things about God. You could look at this story from the human obedience side of things, like so it means I should listen to God. Well, yeah. And we will make that point. That is the fourth point, is just obey, right? That's the takeaway. But in the meantime, you can see some things about God and God's personality and how he treats people, how he interacts with people. Number one, the first thing you should know is that the king is unbothered by his subjects' opinions. Some people, what I mean by that is, some people have this idea that we can have an effect on God. And plenty of people have tried this, have tried to do something horrible to God, but it doesn't work. Right? Because, it's proved very simply by Luke 24, if you just skip forward a few chapters. Plenty of people do terrible things to Jesus, don't they? And Jesus comes back. So what do you really think you're going to do to drag God down or to, hurt him? How do you think you're really going to effectively hurt God? Now, it's not that God doesn't get sorrowful when people fight him, because he does. It doesn't please him when the people he created are attacking him and trying to get rid of him. That's not joyful to him. His goal, stated multiple times over, is to save people, is to save human beings. When we refuse to be saved, that is disappointing to him. It's not that he enjoys that. It's not that he likes that. God is absolutely displeased in that situation. Yeah, sure. But your disobedience does not negate God's authority. Some people have this silly idea that, like, I can really stick it to God and I can really hurt God because I can really derail his plan if I just, don't listen to him. No, you're not. God is in heaven. You're on the earth. What can you actually do against such reckless love, as it were? What can man do to resist it? God, like the pull of God, the power of God, it was enough to create the whole entire world. It's enough to create the whole entire you and everybody that you know. And then you think somehow that you, as this infinitesimal segment of the system, you think that you're going to be able to hurt God? Like, it just doesn't even make sense. Don't get in the way of the divine steamroller. It's not going to end well for you. If there's anything that you see in the Bible, it is over and over and over again, God will do what God planned to do. You can help him do that, or you can resist and get run over. But there is no in between, right? And there is no I'm going to resist God to the point where God can't beat me, because that's physically impossible. Even if you were to argue the stupid, there's an unstoppable force and an immovable object, and can God create a rock that God can't lift, and stupid stuff like that. Like, even if you were to argue that, you're not an immovable object. Like, even if you were to take the most illogical of logical positions, there is no universe in which God created you and you can resist him. Quit trying. It's not going to go well. God is not bothered by how you feel about him. God is not bothered by if you obey him or not. He will keep on going. He will do his thing. You can get on his team or you can be off his team. One of those is going to be a lot more pleasant to you. God's trying to be nice to you. So get on his team and get out of his way. Otherwise, you won't like it. God is unbothered by his subjects' opinions. You're not going to dissuade him from his course. You should also know about God that God is aware. The king is aware of his subjects' opinions. Some people take that to the opposite extreme. Well, if God's not bothered by the subject, by the opinions of human beings, maybe God's just kind of aloof. Like, maybe God just doesn't know. Like, he's just going to do his own thing, and then we also exist, but it's kind of, there's like a void in between us. There's this idea that floats around a lot that God created the world, and then he just kind of let go of it, and he's just kind of watching it happen. And it's spinning around there, and God's there too, somewhere. But he doesn't know you. He doesn't see what happens. He's just kind of like, it's more like God is creating a diorama, a little science experiment, and then like watching the little bacteria like propagate in the petri dish, and eventually God's just gonna be like, and throw the petri dish away. And some people think God is like that he's not involved at all, and that he doesn't care how people think about him, or he doesn't even know, because he just isn't zoned into it. He doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. They have this idea he created the world and now he's gone. Well, there's a point at which that's kind of true. It is true that God is aloof from the world. He is bigger than the world. Sure, like, I agree with that. He is more than the world, yes. But does that mean that he is... I mean, like, what does that mean? Does that mean that he ignores everything? Well, no. I am bigger than a lot of things. I am bigger than my child, but I do not ignore my child, right? That's not how this works. Your assumption that God has created the world and then just left us to do whatever we want to means that you don't think God really created man in his image. You don't think man is really important to God. You don't think the world is really important to God. You think it was his pet project that then he just kind of moved on from. Well, that's a supposition. Nothing in the Bible ever backs that up. That may be your idea, but there's no reason to believe anything like that. In fact, what the Bible is very insistent about is that God created the world and now he sustains it. It's an active thing. He continually sustains it, because if he didn't keep providing the resources for us to breathe, we wouldn't breathe. But God is here to help. God is not missing all this stuff that's happening on the earth. God is very aware of it. So when you say human actions, when you think about the things that humans do, if your natural instinct is to say, well, God doesn't know what I do, you probably need to rein that back in, because I think he does. If your natural instinct is to say the way I live doesn't matter to God, well, yeah, it does. He's pretty aware of that. Your actions are visible to him. The way you live, God knows it, so be careful with that. Human intentions, the thoughts of the heart, the way that you think and process information, God's aware of that too. God sees not as man sees. God judges, or God looks at the heart, is the line from 1 Samuel. Don't think God being bigger than you means God is unaware of you. In fact, a lot of times, God knows you better than you know yourself. Not a lot of times, it's all the time. God understands you to a level that you don't. Yes, he's bigger than the world. It means he's more capable. It doesn't mean that he has ignored it and left it alone. This is a comforting thing for the faithful. If you love God, he knows it. Even if you fail, even if you struggle, even if you fall and do some evil sometimes, if you love God, he knows the heart, and he judges based on that. He's aware of how you're thinking, how you're feeling. This is also terrifying for the unfaithful, because if you're evil, he knows it. And even if you take good actions and you look like you're doing righteous things, if your heart's not right with God, he's aware. God knows you. He knows you personally. The question is, are you for him or not? God is you're not going to get in his way, right? He's not going to be impeded by your opinions, but he does know your opinions. And he's interested in you following after him. The king is very aware of his subjects' opinions. And thus, the king's subjects are rewarded according to their work. When God returns in his full kingship in this story, he begins by making judgments. He calls his slaves before him. It's over all his citizens, ultimately. He's making judgments over everyone in the kingdom, but he begins with his slaves, and he deals personally with his slaves. In the picture here, I believe that Christians are his slaves, and the world around, the non-Christians would be all the other citizens, right? The Christians are the slaves, and everybody else is also there. God gets to make some judgments on those things. The slaves get a special treatment, which is a personal judgment by God, which is to say, you don't get lumped in with all the rest of the citizens, but you do have to give an accounting of yourself. There's a blessing there, and there's also a danger there. It can be terrifying. The slaves get differentiated. Those who are obedient are blessed with further opportunity for obedience. Those who are disobedient are, well, they don't have to worry about anything else, because they get thrown out with the rest of the regular citizens who hate God, and then all of those citizens are executed in front of him. Everyone gets what he asks for. The execution lets people out of the presence of God. The execution lets people ignore God. You don't want to work for God? Fine, you don't have to. Get executed instead, right? Those are your two options. It's easy. You get to make a choice on that. You just won't like the being executed part of it. That's not going to go well for you. But you get to make that choice if you really want to make that choice. And ultimately, God judges all. I don't know what all happens with the citizens outside. These enemies of mine who didn't want me to reign over them, bring them here. The ever-eternal question is, what if somebody's not a Christian, but they had a good heart, and they were very legitimate, and they were trying to be faithful, but they didn't know what faithful looked like, and they never heard about Jesus, and yada, yada, yada. I have no idea. Go ask God about it. He's the one in charge. He's the judge. He knows the heart, and he knows if someone was legitimate or not, if someone was faithful or not. He's the one who ultimately gets to make that decision, so let him make that decision, and instead of trying to make that decision for him. I think, bring here these enemies of mine who didn't want me to reign over them. If someone legitimately just doesn't know who God is, maybe I don't know that they've made the choice that they didn't want God to reign over them. I don't know that they're grouped in with the enemies of God. At the same time, if they just don't know Jesus and don't really care about him, well, that's a different question entirely, because salvation is through the blood of Christ. And if you don't know that, and if you don't want to listen to that, you're going to get yourself in trouble. So, I don't know. Again, that's up to God at the end of the day. Don't ask me. I don't have an answer for it. It's just, it's whatever God decides. He's the one who's in charge. He's the one who gets to judge. The point here is not trying to determine the fate of the potentially faithful Gentile who never had the opportunity. The point is, if you are an enemy of God, your end is going to be very poor. Don't be one of those guys. And that's where we leave it. But the last thing you have to consider is, it's not just how the king deals with his subjects, it's how his subjects deal with him. Which is to say, the fourth and last point here is, you should just obey. But it's not like, oh, you should just be faithful, right? It's you should just obey. I don't exactly know how far to push this point, but I think it's worth considering. God judges based on the heart. We know that, right? We know that you can do all the right actions and have the wrong heart, and God will judge you for that. It doesn't really matter if you do all the right actions if you have a bad heart. God will judge you for that. It doesn't really matter if your heart's not in it, if you don't care about it, if you're not interested in really being righteous, you just want to look righteous. That's not going to fly with God. We know that. But and I don't know exactly how to balance this on this other side of things. What the king says in verses 22 and 23 is very interesting to me. And again, I don't know exactly what to do with this. What he says in verse 22, the slave is protesting. This third slave, the unfaithful one. He got a mina, he didn't do anything with it. He didn't even put it in the bank, right? Because, verse 21, I was afraid of you. You're a demanding man. You take what you don't lay down and reap what you don't sow. Here's the answer. From your own lips I will judge you, you worthless slave. Did you know that I am a demanding man, taking up what I did not lay down and reaping what I did not sow? So why did you not put my money in the bank, and when I came back I would have collected it with interest? This is not to say that it's perfectly acceptable if you take what God has given you and hide it in the bank and invest it somewhere where nobody actually sees it. That's not to say that that's what you should be doing. I don't know that this is the king approving of that course of action so much as saying, well, that's better than nothing, right? It's better for me to make the interest to keep my money current with inflation than it is for me to not have any interest and suddenly my money's worth even less than it was when I left it with you. I don't know that that's like the acceptable course. But the real question that the king is asking is, if you knew that I was so terrible, why did you not even try? Like, there's an element to this which says, if your heart's not in it, even if you go through all the motions and your heart's not in it, you're not going to make it because you don't actually care. But there's also a thought process in this, which is, your heart's not in it. Like, you don't want to be helping him, but you're also so terrified of not helping him that you end up helping him anyway. I don't think that's good. Like, I don't think that's optimal. That's not really what God wants in a perfect world. But at least you're trying something. And at least you're not totally rebellious, because you are trying to do something that's righteous. This is not to say that God is terrible. The nobleman never says, yeah, you're right, I'm a terrible person, but I'm going to take advantage of your work. He says, if you thought that I was so terrible, why did you not try and do something? If I was so terrible, why did you not even try to make peace with me? If I was so destructive and awful, like, wouldn't you have attempted to try something to make me happy, if I just glory in hurting people, like you seem to imply that I do, would you not have tried to get out of that? Would you not have tried to do something nice for me so I didn't come back and hurt you? Like, what? This isn't even logical. If you hate me so much, if you think I'm so evil, then do something to appease the wrath before the wrath comes for you. It doesn't even make sense that you wouldn't serve God in that case. Love him or hate him, you're going to obey him. There is no logical answer in which you say, God exists and I don't want to listen to him. Or in which you say, God exists and I will not listen to him. Even if you don't want to, because you think he's a terrible person, or you think he's absolutely evil, or you think he glories in destruction, or you think he just loves casting people into hell, why would you give him the pleasure of casting you into hell? Why would you make him happy by destroying yourself? Why would you resist his call? If you know that something terrible is going to happen to you if you resist his call, why would you do that? If you think he's so evil and vindictive, why not try to appease him and to extend an olive branch, and then, who knows, maybe that works. I don't know if it works. God has said, if your heart's not in it, you're judged for that. But I don't know that it doesn't work. And maybe it would be better to say, God, I don't really like you very much, but I know I need to obey you. And so try to obey God from that perspective instead of just saying, I don't like you, therefore I'm going to ignore you. Maybe it is better, the first way. God isn't terrible, but if you believe he is terrible, then you should go and serve him anyway. I don't know how God judges every individual case. I'm not recommending that you say, God, I hate you, but I'm going to be obedient because otherwise I'm going to go to hell, and I don't want to go to hell. Not a great motivation for serving him, not wonderful, not what God wants. God wants to inspire love in people. He wants people to love him. He wants to, see a return on his investment. But at the very least, you should be trying to be obedient, even if you don't really like God very much. You should be trying to be obedient. I think the hope is maybe some people get scared into obedience at first. They see how terrible God is. They see how violent God is. They see all these terrible things that God will do, and they get scared, and so they obey him. And then through the course of obedience, when you start to actually read some about God, you start to realize, actually, he's not terrible. Actually, he's pretty great. Actually, he is really nice. Like, what was all that earlier nonsense about that I used to believe? And once you get used to that, then you start to see the reality of the situation, which is God is loving, God is merciful, God is gracious to the people who are obedient to him. I don't know exactly how that works because I'm not the judge, and ultimately we're going to leave that one up for God. But if I had to warn you of anything, I would say, even if you are in doubt about who God is, just obey. It's a better bet to try and obey even if your heart's not fully in it than it is to have your heart not fully in it and just absolutely reject God and spit on his offer and just insult him to his face. One of those, I don't know that either of those will get you into heaven, but one of them has a better shot of it. Maybe trying to do what's right even if you don't really buy it. Maybe that is a better shot than just outright ignoring him totally. So in conclusion, obey and be righteous, or at the very least, stop getting in God's way. Stop making him lose his investment. God is not going to like that very much. He is loving, he is merciful, absolutely, that is who he is, but there's also that balance. He is severe sometimes. He is just. He does have expectations, because God is not one-dimensional. Like any good parent, he comes from a place of love. He's primarily loving, but there are moments where you must be severe to correct disobedience and to correct evil. Like any good parent, God is a balance in there. Not just one or the other. He is both and. That's a lesson that we learn from the parable of the 10 minas, and hopefully there's something there for you to consider. Again, I don't know exactly how to phrase all that. I don't know exactly how to push all of those, or how far to push those ideas, but I think they are worth considering. So give that a think, and if you got any questions, well, let me know. On Wednesday, I'll release the video on I filmed it a few days ago. What was it? On prophets, the prophets, how to read the Bible, specifically the prophets section. And on nothing on Friday, I don't think. And next week I'll do the Sunday morning thing, and then Psalms for the class, and then the next step in Matthew 7. Judge not that you be not judged. Ooh, that's a fun one. And we'll talk about that in a week and a half. See you then.